All set?
Yeah.
Okay, so Father Peter Kusser, and we will be focusing on moral theology. And let me just make sure I get the questions out. I have them before me. Okay, so first is, there is this handout, which is the outline. I'm going to go through the entire outline. Next week, it won't be recorded, but next week we'll focus on the questions themselves. But right now, I will simply focus on the outline. So beginning, number one, nature of human happiness and the ultimate purpose of life. Desire for happiness. So God has created us with a natural desire for happiness. It can only be fulfilled in God. It is filled in God, as you were taught in dogmatic theology, by the beatific vision, where we see God, analogously speaking, in an unmediated way, through a special gift of grace called the light of glory. Ultimate true happiness is not located in money, power, pleasure, honor, or achievements. Money, power, pleasure, honor, or achievements. Ultimate happiness is found in love of God, and of course, love of neighbor properly ordered to love of God. Two sources of human responsibility. So, it says, it should be just Roman numeral 2. So sources of human responsibility. Source of human responsibility will first start with the moral object, followed by the intention, followed by circumstances. Once again, the moral object, then intention, also known as end, followed by circumstances. What is sort of like circling around that moral object and the intention of the doer. First, focus on the moral object to define that. The moral object is not equivalent, not reducible to the physical object, physical act, physical species. If it is, then we wouldn't be able to distinguish murder from killing in self-defense. So be very cautious not to confuse moral object with physical object. They are not equivalent. They are different because the intention is also included along with the physical act, which form a moral object. So intentionality, along with the physical act, bring about the moral object. And this is, part of it is due to the gift of the hylomorphic theory, which was developed in the scholastic age, relying on Greek thought, where created being is made up of hyle, physical matter, and morphe, form. So as you know, a moral act, the matter, like in a sacrament, right? The matter is the two people getting married, man and woman, for the sacrament of marriage. And then the form is their intention, their words. So matter and form. So here again, hylomorphic theory, and it applies directly to the moral object, is it has physical matter and form. And the form is defined by intentionality. Once again, on that point, the moral object is not reducible to the physical object, act, or species. To do so would be to make the error of physicalism, which then makes it impossible to distinguish different human acts, such as murder and killing in defense. It is also not reducible to intentionality. Is that clear with everyone? So it's both and. You cannot reduce the moral object to the physical act, nor can you reduce the moral object to intentionality. Otherwise, a person could commit adultery, break the sixth commandment, and say that my intention was good. Well, no, that's not possible. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, no, it's not possible. It's not impossible just because your intention was good to justify adultery. For example, committed adultery in order to prostitution. How about that? Sorry. Prostitution. So a woman commits prostitution and then justifies it by saying, I need money for my children. We are compassionate to her. Very compassionate. We're merciful and understanding, but it doesn't make the act right. And the circumstances might be atrocious. She might be almost forced psychologically to do this. But nonetheless, the end, intention, does not make the physical means okay. So some physical acts necessarily include an intention regardless of what a person thinks his intention is. So, well, I will use this example. It's a hard one for modern times, but use of a condom is that a person might say, my intention is simply focusing on the union with my wife, and that's the only reason why I'm doing it, and to protect her from getting a venereal disease because I might have a venereal disease. But nonetheless, the act itself splits apart the unitive and procreative end, splits apart the babies and bonding, which God wills to be united together, because the primary end is procreation, babies. Secondary end is the unitive. So that's an example, the best I can do without being a moral theologian, to explain to you the moral object. Once again, it's a both and. Moral object includes both a physical act and intention. We can make an error by defining a moral object only by intentionality, which then a prostitute can justify her acts, or a person using a condom, because of the a good intention they have. So that would be an error. An error also would be to be overly physical in defining a moral object and forget intentionality. So it's both and. All of that, once again, is on your outline. In addition, the documents I sent you, over 200 pages, we'll have that in further detail. Let's now go to intention or end. So, one way is when we're thinking about these sources of morality, if we just think them in a categorical way, where they don't relate to each other, we got it wrong. There's overlap. They're informing one another. And why? Well, all three need to be good for the moral act to be good. Circumstances, intention, moral object. So, I need to go away from the camera a little bit. Hopefully you can still see me. But if you see it more like this, you see that? Instead of like this. Or like this. So, moral object, and you have intention and circumstances. They inform one another. Otherwise, if you have the image wrong, because some of us are very image focused and we just think in categories, it'll be very hard to understand moral object and see that it includes both intentionality and a physical act. Okay, it's both and. And not to make the error either on the side of physicalism or emphasizing intentionality excessively, where we just define a moral object by good intention. So now let's focus on intention, which is the second source of human responsibility. First, the ends do not justify the means. A good intention cannot justify a moral object that is evil, such as adultery. So a good intention cannot justify something that the church defines as intrinsically evil. Moral object must be good along with circumstances and intention for the moral act to be good. Let's focus on circumstances. Circumstances are secondary elements. They cannot make an intrinsically evil act good, nor can an intention make an evil act good. So we have covered these three sources of morality: moral object, circumstances, and intention. We'll now go forward and focus on omission. Omission is sinning by refraining to act when one ought to. Sin of omission, refraining to act when one ought to. Violence, how violence affects the will and relates to culpability. So violence does not directly affect the will. An act that is violently forced is involuntary. So if I'm 100% forced to do something beyond my will, such as, and this can happen, it could happen, men rape men in prisons, and that is terrible. Well, if that man is raped in prison and it's completely involuntary, of course, he's not responsible for that. And the same thing can happen to women. Fear. A moral act that is done in fear is partly voluntary and partly involuntary. This is a very important distinction. Violence, if it's can cause the act to be involuntary, 100%. So a person's not responsible for that. Not responsible if they're raped, etc. It can. Now fear, a moral act that is done in fear is partly voluntary and partly involuntary. It makes sense. No one's twisting my arm, it's not being violent. It's out of an emotional response. So it necessarily will be partly voluntary, partly involuntary. And the level of voluntariness and involuntariness, of course, will differ from act to act. Ignorance. This has to be done this needs to be defined very carefully. So how this affects the will and relates to culpability. Antecedent ignorance. So there's three types of ignorance: antecedent, consequent, concomitant. Let's focus on antecedent. Antecedent ignorance is ignorance that a person is not guilty of. It renders the act involuntary. So let's give an example here. I look behind me and I look in my car mirrors. I do everything I can to see that nobody's behind me when I back up. But there's a little child crawling, and I crush that little child with the car wheel that I'm driving the car. The wheel of the car crushes the child and kills the child. I was ignorant. I had antecedent ignorant. I did everything I could not to be ignorant, so I'm not culpable. Nonetheless, evil has been done, but I'm not culpable. I'm not responsible for it. So that's an example of antecedent ignorance. Consequent ignorance is different. Is ignorance of a person who freely chose to be ignorant. So if we stay with that example, let's say that my grandmother is behind the car. And I know that I should check the window, I should look behind me, I know that I should look at the mirrors, and then I think, I'm just lazy, and I'm in a rush. And I just sort of close my eyes and back up and I hit my grandmother. I would be responsible for that. I didn't know she was there, but I could have done something so that I wouldn't have been ignorant. So that'd be consequent ignorance. It does not render the act involuntary. It may lessen the voluntariness. It may, but not necessarily. And we'd have to come up with different examples for that. But right now I just focus on the principles, and I know Father Milady is very happy if I just focus on the principles and not so much on the cases and examples. So antecedent ignorance renders the act involuntary. Consequent ignorance is when I choose to be ignorant, and then I do something that I later very likely will regret, but I could have prevented it. Or, and then concomitant ignorance accompanies the act without influencing the will. This is not voluntary ignorance, but the person will act the same even if he knows, does not remove culpability. So here is an example. Concomitant ignorance is, I'm trying to give an example. Okay, I have a sword, right? And I like sword fighting. I don't like sword fighting, okay? But I'm just saying, I like taking a sword and just putting it in the air. And there is someone behind a curtain. I don't know that person's behind the curtain. And I'm just going like this, and I go boom, and it goes right into his throat. Now, I find out, I say, oh look, I just plunged my sword into his throat. And then someone asked me later, if you had known that he was behind there, would you still have done that? And my response is, it didn't make a difference. I don't really care. Now, I always do that. It's his fault. Do you see what I'm saying? So that would be an example of concomitant ignorance. It's where I will act the same even if I know. I just don't care. It doesn't remove culpability. Do you see the difference? I know it sounds odd, and I don't teach moral theology, so I know the principles, but you probably could come up with better examples. But that would be an example. So there are three types. Antecedent, where I do everything I can not to be ignorant, or I don't have the possibility to remove my ignorance. I don't have the catechism. No one introduces me to Jesus Christ in a credible way, or moral teaching in a credible way. So I'm ignorant. And if I had the opportunity, I would. So it renders the act involuntary. Consequent ignorance is where, if I had known, I wouldn't have done that, but I freely chose to remain in ignorance. It could be out of laziness, it could be out of fear because I might be then responsible for something and I don't want to read it, I get nervous, or no. And concomitant ignorance doesn't make a difference. If I knew or if I didn't know, I'd still do the same act. Does that help? Hopefully? Okay. Now let's go to 3 moral determinants. Let me just look at... Okay. So 3 moral determinants. Object, intention, circumstances. Object, intention, circumstances, and we've already covered that. Nature of conscience. Man acquires early in life. First principles. Foundational. So first principle refers to foundational moral. First principle is do good, avoid evil. The habit of repulsion from evil and attraction to good is called synderesis. That's a habit. So principle is, I'm born with it, do good, avoid evil. And then as I live and I become older, I develop a habit for avoiding evil and being attracted to good, and that habit is called synderesis. Conscience is an act, not a habit. This is very important, especially when you are tested by a moral theologian. Conscience is an act, not a habit. It's an application of that habit. A habit is a lasting quality, an act is an event. So my conscience becomes I activate that habit, and then I'm making a conscious decision. The practical intellect's judgment on how to act with respect to good and evil is conscience. It is an act, not a habit. Let's move forward to synderesis, or amnesis, is deeper than conscience. So if you go through different levels, I'm born with first principle, do good, avoid evil. I then develop a habit of avoiding evil, at least I'm supposed to, and being attracted to the good. In life, that habit becomes ingrained in me the more times I make conscious decisions, which are acts. Now, if I make conscious decisions that are evil conscious decisions, it will necessarily affect the habit that supports it. And gradually repeated acts of an erroneous conscience, this deeper level of synderesis, which is a habit, can be gradually forgotten, such as during World War II, there were German Nazis who were in charge of death camps that killed Jewish people, Catholic people, Romani, etc. There's one famous case where a man is on trial and he does not express any guilt. So how can that be? Well, it can be this way. He's born with first principle, do good, avoid evil. He at one time may hopefully had this habit of doing good of being repulsed from evil and attracted to good. But after many, many conscious acts, he started forgetting that habit. He started forgetting the first principle until finally it's almost incapable for him of knowing what is good and what is evil. He no longer has any moral conscience. It's been forgotten. So that's the best I can do with that. Now let's go to binding nature of an erroneous conscience. First, required to obey certain judgment of conscience even if erroneous. So let me repeat that again, very clear. I am required to obey a judgment of conscience if it's certain, even if it's erroneous. Even if it's wrong, I must obey my conscience if I have certainty. And I'm not culpable for that, as long as it is antecedent ignorance. Remember, antecedent ignorance. I've done everything I could, all the possibilities that providence has allowed me to form my conscience. And so we've covered, if ignorance is antecedent, then the person is not culpable for evil committed. But if ignorance is consequent, then the person is culpable for evil committed. So, if I have an erroneous conscience, and someone tells me that those acts you're doing are hurting you and others, because that's the definition of sin. Sin leads to misery. It's disordered love, and it hurts you, it's going to hurt others. You may think that you're doing good, but you really aren't. I am confident that I am right. I'm not doing evil. I'm actually helping people. So a person says, well, please read the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Please read this book by John Harding and others, which will help you to see that what you think is good, a good act, is actually an evil act. And I think about it, and then I refuse. At that moment, that refusal, because I've been given this opportunity for good, reliable sources, would then cause my ignorance to be consequent, because I'm not open to knowing further about the truth. But if I'm never given that opportunity, and often people aren't, then it is antecedent ignorance. I am bound to follow my erroneous conscience. Evil will happen, but I'm not culpable, responsible for it. But let's not forget that evil still is being committed and people being hurt, and including the individual. But God does not hold that individual responsible. Formation of conscience. Okay, first now we go to binding nature of correct conscience. It's required to obey certain judgment of conscience even if erroneous. Okay, that needs to be affirmed. Now, formation of conscience. Required to form conscience in accordance with truth so as to have a correct standard by which to judge. So, and we already covered different types of ignorance. Antecedent, consequent, concomitant. Antecedent means I'm given no opportunity to take away my ignorance. I'm not responsible for that sinful act. Consequent is I am given opportunities and I refuse to further enlighten my intellect with truth. I'm responsible. And concomitant, even if someone tells me, it doesn't make a difference, I'll still do it. Now, so in light of those different types of ignorance, we now go to formation of conscience. The Catholic Church teaches we are required to form our conscience in accordance with truth, both natural and revealed, so as to have a correct standard by which to judge, so as to make sure our conscience, which is an act, is in accordance with synderesis, which is a habit of avoiding evil and doing good. Natural law. Let's first define law. Law is an ordinance of reason promulgated for the common good by one who has charge of a community or society. Law is an ordinance of reason promulgated for the common good by one who has charge of a community or society. That comes directly from Thomas Aquinas. There are four kinds of law: eternal, moral, divine, natural laws, and natural law. So let's focus on eternal law. Eternal law are laws that are in God, and God reveals those laws in two ways. First, one way he reveals it is through sacred scripture, divine revealed law, as of course interpreted properly by tradition, divinely revealed law. And another way he reveals his law is through the light of reason, which we call natural law. And natural law is natural, not in respect to irrational creatures, but respect to our natures, because we have a reason. And we can reflect on creation, which is created by a reasonable creator, and we can discover with our reason certain laws within that reasonableness of within creation that reflects the reasonableness of the Creator. So, eternal law, moral laws, divine law, natural law discovered by reason, distinguished from laws of nature, which are proper to irrational creatures, but natural law is not being defined in that way. Natural law refers to laws that God had, that are in creation, that reflect God's goodness, His truth, and that I, because I have a reason, unlike irrational creatures, can bring my mind in correspondence with. So let's focus on natural law again. Not in reference to rational creatures, but in reference to rational creatures. Implies a creator that has written laws, including moral laws in nature. Natural law, according to the Catechism, is eternal, permanent, immutable. Mutable means unchangeable throughout history. So, eternal law, moral law, laws of nature, natural law. Eternal law, law is all in God, because God is the source of all law. And then we have moral laws, and those moral laws are revealed in Scripture, but even apart from Scripture, I can have access to moral laws through the natural light of reason. Laws of nature are proper to irrational creatures, and we've already covered natural law. Difference between old law and new law. The old law is the law of the Old Testament, which taught what to do, but didn't give us the ability to do what we're taught to do. The new law teaches what the Old Testament taught, and with greater intensity, but gives us the ability to do what we ought to do. And that ability is called grace. It actually is more of a relationship. It actually is a relationship. It's a relationship of Jesus Christ with us, where Jesus Christ, as uncreated grace, second person of the Blessed Trinity, we collaborate with that uncreated grace, and from that perspective, our collaboration is created. So old law teaches us what to do, but doesn't give us a relationship in order to do what we ought to do. The new law gives us the means, the grace to do what we ought to do. Let's now move forward to influence of grace on morals. Man cannot avoid sin without the help of grace. Initial grace cannot be merited. After initial grace, man can merit by participating in the perfect merit of Jesus. So, and we have covered this in dogma already, of initial grace and after initial grace. So before initial grace, I cannot merit anything. It's a pure gift. After initial grace, I have a relationship with Jesus, then I can merit, yes, because I participate in His perfect merit. Now, in moral theology, we're going to add a little more, which is, I cannot avoid sin without the help of grace, without that relationship with Jesus Christ, with God. If I just rely on myself to do good and think I can do that, that's called the heresy of Pelagianism, which St. Augustine fought. 354-430 is when he lived. He fought directly with Pelagius. So, we need grace to avoid sin. Even before the fall, this is dogmatic teaching, even before the fall, man could not obey the Ten Commandments out of charity for a supernatural end without grace. To achieve a supernatural end, man must have a supernatural help, grace. and that applies before and after the fall. It's actually a lot of common sense. In order to obtain a supernatural end, which is beyond what nature can provide, I need supernatural help. That's another way of saying I need grace, even before the fall. Because they could obey the 10 Commandments, but there's another requirement, is to do it out of charity for a supernatural end. That they need supernatural help. Nature of virtue. Let's first read what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says. Human virtues are first attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections of intellect and will that govern our actions, order our passions, and guide our conduct according to reason and faith. And you are required to know cardinal virtues, theological virtues, infused moral virtues. 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. Sometimes people identify justice as courage, which is fine, but I'm going to just focus on a fortitude, not this. Instead of prudence, justice, courage, temperance, we'll stay with the more traditional terms: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, and not use courage for fortitude. These are cardinal because they're considered hinge virtues that all other virtues depend on. So prudence is right reason applied to action. Right reason applied to action. Justice, the constant will to give each his due, which includes God, our parents, our friends, our country. Fortitude, firmness in face of difficulties. Temperance, moderation when attracted to by pleasure. So you have temperance and fortitude, they balance each other out. When I am in face of difficulties, I am constant. And temperance, when I am tempted to, by pleasure, to indulge, pleasure is not evil in itself, but to be excessive, then temperance helps me to moderate that, so that pleasure I experience is properly ordered to God. He created pleasure, nothing intrinsically evil in it, unless, of course, it's embedded within an intrinsically evil act, then of course, okay? So, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. Theological virtues. These theological virtues directly relate to God. And you can get it right from the word because it's from Greek, theos. Theo part refers to God, and logical refers to words or reason. So these are virtues that directly relate to God. They are virtues that are infused in us by God and cannot be acquired. They are not natural virtues. So I can't think more and read lots of philosophical books with the expectation I'll have faith, hope, and charity. That's a gift from God. What I can do is ask God for the gift of faith, for the gift of hope, for the gift of charity. Faith, belief in God and all that He has revealed. Hope, desire for heaven. Charity, love God above all and all creation because of God. It's a both and. But first, love God above everything and creation because of God. So we've covered 4 cardinal virtues, theological virtues. Now we go to infused moral virtues. Along with theological virtues, God infuses within us as a gift moral virtues. These moral virtues correspond to theological virtues. They're distinct from acquired virtues. They're distinct from acquired moral virtues. God works these virtues in us without us, as Augustine says. All right. And the infused moral virtues, what they do is they ensure that our acquired human virtues are being done for a supernatural end. But I need a supernatural aid in order for that to happen. So these, along with theological virtues, we're also infused with moral virtues, which transform the acquired moral virtues. So we follow the 10 Commandments out of love of God for a supernatural end, because of the supernatural help that we are given by God through the theological virtues and infused moral virtues. Nature of sin.
Excuse me, Father.
Yes.
So infused moral, this means God grant directly in our soul.
Yes, infused. Like theological virtues.
And acquire the virtues, we practice day by day and we get it.
Oh, we acquire it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can acquire it.
Oh, okay.
I can acquire it, but with infused moral virtues, I can't acquire it. It's given to me as a gift, just as like theological gifts are given to me. Faith, hope, and charity.
Yeah.
So infused moral virtues will correspond to the honesty, but then honesty is being done for a supernatural end. But in order for me to be honest for a supernatural end, because it's above nature, I need to have supernatural help. So we're defining that supernatural help, and we call it, in this applied here, infused moral virtues. If we go back to even before the fall, man could not obey the 10 Commandments out of charity for a supernatural end without grace. So he needed theological virtues and infused virtues. Does that help?
Yeah.
So I could be a perfectly, this is theoretically possible. I could be the most honest person you have ever met. I could be the kindest, gentlest, sweetest soul that you've ever met. But I have acquired all those virtues, but I'm not doing it for a supernatural end, because I lack theological virtues and infused virtues. And when I die, all of that doesn't mean that I can merit heaven. Do you see that?
Right.
But notice, now, once again, I'm not a moral theologian, so I don't want to go too deeply right now than accurate. But Aquinas goes into this in much more detail. And it's very humbling for us. So, yes, acquired virtues are important. But no amount of acquired virtues gives me a right to say that I can have a supernatural end. Because acquired virtues are being acquired by my own natural effort. But I need supernatural help to get a supernatural end, to obtain a supernatural end. And we're defining that here by infused moral virtues. So all those habits are great. Let's say this person now converts and becomes a Catholic. Well, grace builds upon nature. And there's a whole lot there that grace can now transform. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. If you do have any questions, both Dr. Toulon and Father Milady know that this is not my specialty, my field. And I recommend for now, if you send me an email, so I give them plenty of time to answer it accurately. I've done my best right now, okay?
Yeah.
All right. Let's now go to nature of sin. Sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. Another definition, sin is an offense against God. An utterance, a deed, or desire contrary to eternal law. St. Augustine has a very simple definition. Sin is disordered love. But I don't want you to, it's good to have that definition, but right now I want to focus more on the catechism and, of course, a very Thomistically precise definition of sin, with respect where it emphasizes more its relationship to truth. So an utterance, a deed, or desire contrary to eternal law. 4 types of sins, kinds of sins: thought, word, deed, omission. You could just memorize it. It all makes sense. Thought, deeds, word, omission. And it corresponds to one of these questions here, all of this. Causes of sin. The will is the direct cause of sin. Let me repeat that again. My will is the direct cause of sin. When I sin, it is because my will is responsible for it. Exterior acts are indirect causes. So let's say someone persuades me to do something. Okay, that's fine, but they're the indirect cause. I have to consent in order to do that evil act. It can reduce my voluntariness, that's true. They might persuade me and come up with all sorts of rationalization of why I should do this evil act. But nonetheless, I'm the one who has to choose to do that act. So, direct cause is my will. Exterior objects, which here we're also including people, are indirect causes. Mortal and venial sin. Mortal sin destroys charity. Charity here is being defined as a theological virtue. It severs that relationship that I have with God. So, venial sin wounds charity but does not sever it. To be subjectively responsible for an objective mortal sin, there needs to be grave matter, full knowledge, deliberate consent. So here we're making a distinction between mortal sin objectively considered and subjectively considered. Just because I see someone committing a mortal sin, objectively speaking, does not necessarily mean that they're subjectively responsible for that sin in a mortal way. They might be, they might not be. And it might be none of my business to discern. It could be if I'm a parent, I might, or a confessor or a spiritual director, or someone who's trying to help a person out of addictive patterns and their counselor or something. But often, we are called to judge, but we're called to judge something as wrong in itself, and we leave the judgment of the person, of the responsibility for that act, up to God. And that's what Pope Francis, how I interpret his phrase when he said, what did he say? Do not judge.
Do not judge.
Who am I to judge?
Who am I to judge? I'm sorry, I forgot the phrase. On the plane trip. So who am I to judge? So if you interpret it according to here, is that it means who am I to judge the person and his responsibility before God. But of course, he does not mean who am I to judge an act to be good or evil. Objectively speaking, of course, he's on board with that. Okay? So, same time, let me think of something else. Jesus talks about forgiveness. We are to forgive people who've done wrong to us, right? Well, he also tells us, judge not, lest you be judged. The measure you measure out to others will be the measure measured out to you. In that same gospel passage, he also talks about to forgive as your heavenly Father forgives you. Right now, I cannot forgive someone unless I first judge something as evil. So right there, Jesus himself is teaching us to judge something as evil and not good. Only after that can I then forgive. How can I forgive if I already assume that I cannot judge even what is evil from what is good? So by affirming that we are to, and commanding us to forgive, Jesus already is commanding us to judge. Judge something as evil and judge something as good. But once we have judged that, we then forgive. So we can't forgive without first judging. But in this case, the judgment is on the act, not on the person's culpability before God. Their responsibility for God. That's the realm of God. Their intention. That's none of my business. Ordinarily speaking, sometimes, as I said, sometimes parents, counselors, spiritual directors, confessors need to gingerly, cautiously go into that God realm of intention, of personal responsibility. More often than not, it's none of our business. But it certainly is our business to look both ways before crossing the street. It is our business to see that as an objective wrong, child. You should not do that because I love you and I don't want you to be hurt. Taking marijuana is going to hurt you. Or stealing from a store is going to hurt you. That's wrong. It's intrinsically evil. It's going to hurt you. It's going to hurt others. And you might start having a habit of doing that. And children steal. And they have to be corrected. We all know that. Little things like a little candy thing. So parents are obligated to make judgment. Okay, we've covered the distinction between mortal and venial sin. I spent some time on that just so that we make a distinction between what is objectively mortal from what is subjectively mortal. To be subjectively responsible for an objective mortal sin, grave matter, that's the moral object, which includes both intentionality and the physical species. Full knowledge. I can't be ignorant. Remember we came up with a different distinction, antecedent ignorance, consequent and concomitant. So I have to have full knowledge. And then deliberate consent. It's possible for me to commit a intrinsically evil act, to know I'm committing the intrinsically evil act, and yet because of a force of habit, I don't have sufficient deliberate consent. I'm struggling not to, but nonetheless the person does it again. You could give an example of alcoholism. That'd be a good example. Okay, so people struggle. I've had a relative, I will not name the relative, definitely not my father, no one you've met, Sister Anna too, okay? But he struggled, we could say that he struggled with alcoholism. Well, it's possible that he really was trying to be sober. And it's grave, because we're not to lose our capability of reason. He has full knowledge. He went through Catholic schools. He was blessed with that. However, he lacks deliberate consent, and I think that was very, very likely. Often he had this very, very vicious bad habit, and he lacked deliberate consent. Does that help people? Okay, so I hope that his repeated acts of his alcoholism many times were objectively, sinfully, mortally wrong. But subjectively, it's likely he was not responsible for all of those acts that would constitute a mortal sin. It didn't sever his relationship with God, at least I hope, because he died. And he may have died of a liver, very likely, because it destroys your liver, as you know.
Yes.
Yeah. Fountains and nerves, you know that too, so, right? Destroys liver? Okay. So I'll give you an example of that. Now, error of consequentialism. The end or consequences chosen can render an evil act, even if the act is on the abstract pre-moral order is evil in itself a good act. I'll do the best I can. Okay, consequentialism, first, know that it's an error, okay?
Yeah.
So according to this error, that the end or consequences of an act can render an objectively evil act as a good act. That's an error. Wrong, bad, but it's an error of consequences. So according to this, you look at the consequences. If the consequences are sufficient then they can even render something that we considered objectively, intrinsically evil, good. That's what it teaches. Now, it teaches it with a little different vocabulary. So instead of calling instead of using the term moral object, okay, so that's the term the Catechism uses, they use the term abstract pre-moral order. So they, yes, pre-moral. Yeah, so we use the word moral object that is used in the Catechism, moral object, right? And a moral object can be intrinsically evil. And if the moral object is intrinsically evil, no matter how good my intention is, no matter how good the circumstances are, it's wrong. Now, error of consequences says that disagrees. They don't use the vocabulary moral object. Rather, they use the vocabulary of an abstract pre-moral order. I'm just saying what they teach.
Well, I don't know
It's
what
wrong.
that is.
Well, it's fiction. But once again, because you might be tested by Dr. Toolin and others, so if they might ask you this. So they define things differently. They define it as there's an abstract pre-moral order, and I respect that, and it does teach us what is good and evil, abstractly considered, but when you start applying it to life, if the consequences, a consequence or an intention can render that abstract pre-moral evil a good act. That's what they teach. That is contrary to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Okay? So we already came up with the 3 moral determinants, which are moral object, intention, and circumstances. We don't use this language of a pre-moral order. We don't use that language. We don't use the language of an abstract pre-moral order. Everything can be reduced in a nutshell to a premise that they hold, which is the end justifies the mean. Do you see that? We hold that the ends do not justify the means. The consequences do not justify a moral object that is intrinsically evil. Okay? All right. We'll go more into that next class and we can come up with examples. But once again, I know with Father Milady, he taught me, he was my professor, is that he really wants for you to understand the principle before we go into the cases. But next week we can go with cases and that might help you to understand the principle. Okay? Because you're applying it. Now, let's go to fundamental option. First, there are various interpretations of the fundamental option. An erroneous interpretation, and I'm using John Hardin here. An erroneous interpretation is that one cannot commit a mortal sin unless they subjectively reject God. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that according to this erroneous interpretation of the fundamental option, at some point in my life, I have a conversion to Jesus Christ. And at the deepest level of my being, I fundamentally choose Him. Because of that, even if I commit an objective mortal sin, I'm not responsible for it unless I subjectively reject that fundamental choice for Jesus Christ. John Paul II clearly taught that a person's moral dispositions can be completely changed by particular acts. And in so doing, he countered an erroneous presentation of the fundamental option. The only question on the exam is to explain the error of the fundamental option, the erroneous interpretation. There are interpretations of the fundamental option that are not problematic. But I don't have the ability to explain that. I just will say that it is mentioned in magisterial documents, and they're very cautious. They say there's erroneous interpretations and then interpretations that are not problematic. But for the purpose of your exam, all you need to know and all I need to teach you is the erroneous interpretation. Okay? And we can go into that more next week. Formal and material cooperation. So form, remember, link form with will. Link material with physical acts, right? So form, will, intention, end, material with physical acts. Formal cooperation is when a person willfully cooperates in evil done by another. Material cooperation, when a person does not willfully cooperate in evil done by another, but provides material cooperation. So, if I may give an example. Let's say that here's a doctor who is performing an abortion, okay? And his assistant is by his side. The doctor says, give me a forceps, or whatever the utensils are. And his assistant gives him a forceps. And the assistant is not being forced. The assistant is cooperating, and is cooperating in a way where she willfully consents with his evil act. So her form is completely in line with her act. So now, let's say that there's an immigrant who, I'm just trying to come up with something, it's imperfect, but let's say an undocumented immigrant needs a job for their family and it finds a job by sweeping outside of a hospital, but it's not Planned Parenthood, sweeping outside of a hospital, and then find out later that the hospital in one section, but it's not even where they're in charge of sweeping up, is performing abortions. So they are materially cooperating in some way, but not formally. And this undocumented worker is Catholic. They completely reject abortion. They don't agree with it. Do you see the difference? Mm-hmm. So there is material cooperation at some level happening by sweeping the sidewalk. They need the money for their family. But it's not formal cooperation, okay? Now, we're going to go further because we're going to make a distinction between immediate material cooperation and mediate. So there's a further distinction. But right now, if you get this in your mind, an assistant of an abortionist, that assistant is directly and formally cooperating. Both of them are engaging materially in the abortion, and both of them consent. They think that abortion is a good thing, and they agree to it, even though it's intrinsically evil. The undocumented worker sweeping the sidewalk in front of a big hospital and then finds out in a section there's abortions being performed, does not formally cooperate because their will does not. Now, let's go to an immediate, and that's called material cooperation. Formal, my will consents. Material, I'm doing something, I am cooperating, but not with my will. Now, immediate material cooperation is always immoral. Always immoral. An assistant who does not agree with the act but assists a doctor in abortion. So let's take that example. There's a doctor and there's an assistant. The assistant is immediately helping him. Hand me the forceps. The assistant immediately is helping him. So now that assistant could be telling herself the whole time that this abortion is wrong and I disagree with it, but keeps on handing him and right by his side. So it's immediate. That is always immoral. Now, mediate material cooperation may be moral, and that would be removed from the action. like this person sweeping the sidewalk, right? But for it to be moral, the principle of double effect needs to apply. Now, if we can just end there with respect to the case that I came up with, and we'll go to the principle of double effect, and we'll just focus on the principle itself. I do have documentation here which should give examples of it, but I want to put aside the example I just gave, where I made a distinction between formal and material cooperation, and then made a further distinction between immediate cooperation, which is always wrong, even if a person's will doesn't agree, but it's too close to the action, and immediate material cooperation, which is further removed, the sweeper, but could be moral if the principle of double effect applies. I want first now to let go of the case and focus on the principle. So, principle of double effect. The moral act to be done must be good in itself or at least morally indifferent. Okay, so the moral act to be done must be good in itself or at least morally indifferent. The good effect must not be obtained by means of the evil effect. The evil effect must not be intended for itself but only permitted. There must be a proportionally grave reason for permitting the evil effect. At least the good and evil effect should be nearly equivalent. So I do want to go, just bear with me, and I want to go to John Harding and go to the principle of double effect, because he has good examples.
That would like the one that has
Yeah.
cancer of the uterus.
Yes, perfect. So here is, it's on page 140. Okay? So if we just focus and stay on the text, because once again, it's not my specialty. Here it is. Oh, there it is. Oh, good. So we have an example. A classic example of the principle of double effect is the treatment of ectopic pregnancy. Oh no. Okay, so okay, well, it's his example he gives, okay? So, the fertilized egg implants in the wall of the fallopian tube of the woman, which means that the woman is at risk of dying because of her pregnancy. So that fertilized egg is a human being. So, does the church require for her to die? That's the question. Okay, so the church does not. The principle of double effect applies. The removal of part of the fallopian tube to prevent or stop the internal bleeding of the mother is not evil per se, is removing the fallopian tube. The preborn baby is not directly aborted. The embryo will die, for it is too young for viability outside of the mother's womb. The purpose of the procedure is not to abort the ectopic pregnancy. The purpose is to save the life of the woman. All four conditions called for by the principle of double effect are met in this example. Okay, I'm sure there's an example from warfare would also be an example.
On the double effect.
Yeah, a person who's torpedoing
Yes.
an enemy ship,
Oh, yes. Well, the act in itself is not,
Because it's a just war. Yeah.
because it's a just war, but, I mean, if the ship sinks and there's sailors in the ocean,
Yeah.
the opposing naval force has a moral responsibility to save the lives of those sailors.
I have a good example. I know this is a
Oh,
good
well, that's not a good example. of
No,
that.
no, no, I have a good example, because that might confuse people if I may just jump in. And this was told to me, now I just remembered. So people go to medical school, right? In medical school, people need to study anatomy. So do artists, okay? But we'll focus on medical school, it's more convincing. So medical schools, they focus on anatomy, and let's say someone who's a very sensitive conscience goes to confession and says, you know, I'm studying anatomy, and you know, I feel excessively attracted every time I look at this page. It's like looking at a pornographic magazine. Maybe I should stop medical school. So here is, you can ask them, well, first of all, the moral act to be done must be good in itself, or at least morally indifferent. The pictures he's looking are not intended to evoke the response he's experiencing. Okay, so that's be pornographic.
Right.
It's just presenting the human body objectively. It has no intention to bring this effect that he's experiencing. So it is morally indifferent. It's just picture of human body. The good effect must not be obtained by means of the evil effect. So the good effect is knowledge of the human body so that he can heal the human body. That's a good effect. It's not obtained by means of the evil effect, which is his disordered attraction, right? It's obtained by looking at the page. Secondarily, he has this evil effect, but that's not the means by which he gets the good effect. Third, the evil effect must not be intended for itself, but only permitted. You can ask him, well, did you go to medical school for the reason to look at these pictures? No, of course not. And he wouldn't have been coming to confession in the first place anyway. So he's struggling with this. So, no, I came to medical school because I want to be a doctor. My father was a doctor, my mother was a doctor. I also, I'm attracted to the salary position, the prestige that goes with it. And of course, I also like saving people. I like helping people. So the evil effect must not be intended for itself, but only permitted. It's permitted. There must be a proportionally grave reason for permitting the evil effect. So here, it's more clear in medical school than art school. But in medical school, it's clear because we need good doctors. Especially if he's a very good Catholic, he's coming to confession. We have many doctors who are willing to perform abortions. Well, not many, but some. So we have this. There's a proportionally grave reason for permitting the evil effect, and he's not doing anything beyond that. So at least the good and evil effect should be nearly equivalent. Does that help people with that example? That was told to me one time. So here is, that would be an example of the principle of double effect. I don't know, I know because that was explained to me and I remembered it with clarity. It made perfect sense to me by a reliable person. But I don't know if you can how to apply that principle of double effect to the example I gave you with this undocumented worker outside of a large hospital, right? You need to ask a moral theologian how it applies in that case, okay?
Right.
Yeah. But the one I came with is safe and it's guaranteed that that's a good example of the principle of double effect. And then there are examples from warfare that John Hardin uses, and I thought it was here. I was almost positive that he came up with a torpedo and there's he doesn't intend the consequences of certain people on the ship.
No, that's not the intent, it's just
Yeah.
to destroy the ship.
Yeah, it's just to destroy the ship, that's right. So, but next class, I'll try to remember to, and I will have my computer with me to bring John Hardin in the picture and good examples, okay? Okay, now let's move forward. Oh, by the way, it's good to focus on the principle of double effect because I do know that many times during the moral portion of the exam, this question has come up, and students many times have not done well. So try to master the principle of double effect. And I also am speaking to Stephen as well, so please do so. Church's teaching on the evil of contraception as opposed to natural family planning. We actually already sort of covered this because we talked about the ends of marriage. So we were talking about babies and bonding, unitive and procreative. So their ends of marriage, our primary end is procreative, children. Secondary end, less important, is unitive, bonding, mutual help. Tertiary end, to be fully accurate, there is a tertiary end, it's least important. Its end is remedy for concupiscence. That comes from Revelation, 1 Corinthians 7:9, and you can also see it affirmed in 59 of Casti Connubii. But it's the least important. So first, procreation. Second, unitive. Third, concupiscence. As a remedy for concupiscence. And that doesn't apply to all people. Fourth, chief reason. Pius XI says this. The chief reason for marriage, principal reason, is mutual sanctification and perfection of the spouses. So that's what makes it a sacrament. Otherwise, we're just on the natural end. We're just approaching marriage naturally. So yes, you have these three ends, primary, secondary, tertiary, but let's not forget the primary, chief reason. You'll find that in Ephesians 5 as well. Yeah, perfect, yes. Procreation, and it's also to represent in a sacramental way Christ's union with this church, in Ephesians. So the chief reason is mutual sanctification and perfection of the spouses.
So that's why it's called a natural sacrament. No?
Is it called a natural sacrament?
Marriage
It's the adjective naturally used
is the thing.
in sacramental theology? If you could find me the quotation for that, then I'll look at the context.
Okay.
Because sacraments, by definition, have a supernatural end. So I'm just confused by it. But baptism, you can say, is a universal sacrament. That's why a Muslim can baptize someone.
Right. I've heard it used by...
I think so too, but I'd like to know the context, and I want to be precise. So
okay.
yeah, but if you find it, then next class we can talk about that. But right now, the ends of primary end, procreation, unitive, concupiscence, and the chief reason, let's not forget that, is sanctification, perfection of the spouses. They help each other, they're their friends, okay? For a supernatural end. Do you see the difference there?
Mm-hmm.
Supernatural end. Oh, okay, contraception. Contraception is disordered since it prioritizes, makes more important, a lesser end over a primary end. The lesser end is unitive and makes that more important, overrules the procreative end. So, marriage is a sacrament of Christ's total unconditional self of himself as gift to the church, gift to the church. Contraception falsifies the sacramental dimension of marriage since either one or both spouses refrain from giving themselves unconditionally as a total gift in the marital act. So there the church is saying that, and because of the chief reason is mutual sanctification, perfection of the spouses. The sacrament is a sacred sign instituted Christ to give us grace, and is also to be a sacred sign, of course, of heavenly reality. So in that sense, it falsifies the sacramental dimension of marriage. So on that note, we move to euthanasia and abortion. Euthanasia. Killing those who suffer to end the suffering is gravely immoral. Killing those who suffer to end the suffering is gravely immoral. So that is not in reference to extraordinary means, as Valentine, who works in a nursing home, knows very well. Discontinuing burdensome medical procedures that are extraordinary is legitimate. However, we have to give nutrition and hydration as long as the body can accept it. You know, I can't start forcing water on the person, or so. But as long as the body can accept it, then we ought to give at least some hydration. And also for charity purposes, like when my mother was dying, well, you take a little sponge and you put it on her tongue, just so that she doesn't suffer as much. So, okay, so we have that. Use of painkillers, even if they hasten death, is legitimate as long as, Catechism of the Catholic Church, death is not willed as either an end or a means, but only foreseen and tolerated as inevitable. So my mother did have to take, in her dying days, she had to take morphine. And according to what I read, Valentine, morphine can hasten death, right?
Yeah.
So here is, it was not given in a huge dose, I don't think, by the nurse. A little bit, right? A little bit. And it was given to, and it was given only because the death was foreseen as inevitable. She was going to die very soon, within a couple days or maybe a week. It lessened her pain, and it was considered legitimate, according to the Catholic Church, because it was not, the death was not willed either as an end or a means. It was only foreseen as tolerated, as inevitable.
Oh, okay. I can see where that makes
Okay.
sense.
But sometimes morphine is given too much, and then it's actually, death is willed as an end or means, and Valentine knows that happens in the medical world,
That's true.
right?
Yeah, it's true. Morphine usually you use that for
Yeah.
keep the pain away,
Yeah.
but the pain is coming. The most morphine you give it is the more close people will die. And morphine is also it's killing people, but slowly.
Yeah. So,
So what about the soldier on the battlefield who doesn't have any legs and arms, and he's going to expire, and the medic gives him too much morphine, then that would be considered morally wrong.
well, we need to make a distinction between objectively and subjectively.
Right.
So,
Because it is inevitable.
and I have actually served directly someone who had his whole torso blown apart,
Yeah.
and actually a couple. One who was actually recently taken off the battlefield and was called immediately in. It was really painful to minister, but it was very important. I see what you're saying. Well, I would say objectively it's wrong.
No, it's not objectively wrong, yeah.
Well, subjectively, well, objectively,
Oh.
it seems wrong. But subjectively, is the person responsible for it, given all those conditions, culpable?
Yeah, the level of culpability
That's
has
right.
got to be pretty
Yeah,
slim.
yeah, and there's so many things occurring. That, does he have full knowledge of what he's doing? Does he have full intentionality?
Or does the medic have full intentionality?
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
is it an emotional response?
Yeah, emotional response. It's very tricky. So Father Milady really recommends that moral theology doesn't focus too much on cases.
Right.
So we get on the principles and then apply it, and then life is very, very messy. It's very messy. But first we need to get the principles down, and they need to be clear, ingrained in our minds and our hearts, and we need to own it. So the principle is that discontinuing burdensome medical procedures that are extraordinary is legitimate. Use of painkillers, even if hastened death, is legitimate as long as death is not willed either as an end or a means, but only foreseen and tolerated as inevitable. It seems that the example you came violates that, so
Yeah.
which means that's the catechism, it's objectively wrong. At the same time, I was trying to say that I can emotionally and by experience connect with that because of my service as a contract military chaplain. But nonetheless, faithful to the catechism, it is a violation of it. Okay? Human life is sacred from the moment of, and I also knew a medic, by the way, who lost his mind, and I served him in a lockdown psych ward. Medics have make many hard calls.
Oh, yeah.
And he lost his mind because he came to this country and he saw basically someone murdered before him, and just lost it.
Yeah.
So, he did graduate out of the lockdown psych ward, and I saw him afterwards. So, human life is sacred from the moment of conception to natural death. Abortion is a grave offense. So I don't think we're going to have any problems on the abortion here. We're very pro-life, which is a great blessing. Next class, I will go over all of the questions. Just systematically go over the questions. I hope this video, especially for Stephen, was helpful. God bless. Sister Anna.